This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and more dangerous. It's about what happens when decisions that can end lives stop being anchored to reality. Not because of chaos, but because the system that is supposed to slow things down quietly disappears. Most people think disasters begin with explosions. They don't. They begin when warnings are treated as noise, when analysis is optional, when momentum becomes policy. Right now, there is a widening gap between what is known and what is acted on. And in that gap, consequences don't wait for permission. If you stay with me, I'm going to walk you through how that gap formed, why it keeps widening, and why, once it does, it stops caring who gets caught inside it. Because this isn't about ideology. It's about a system that no longer hears itself think. And once you see it, you can't unsee where it's heading. Most people believe power sits with leaders, with speeches, with faces on screens. That belief is comforting and wrong. What actually controls the system now is momentum. Procedural momentum, institutional inertia. Decisions don't move because someone is persuasive. They move because stopping them would require friction. And friction has been engineered out. The system rewards action over accuracy, speed over reflection, confidence over doubt. Analysis still exists. Briefings still get written, but they no longer decide outcomes. What decides outcomes is alignment, who is speaking the same language, who reinforces the same assumption, who makes escalation feel inevitable instead of optional. And once a system reaches that point, personalities stop mattering, because even replacement doesn't change direction. What you're watching isn't recklessness, it's automation. And automation doesn't ask if it's right, it only asks if it's next. That's where the danger begins to accelerate. This didn't happen overnight. That's the part most people miss. There was a time when escalation felt heavy, slow, deliberate. Before meant hesitation. Before meant dissent mattered. Before meant someone could still say, stop, and be heard. Now, escalation feels normal. Routine. Administrative. The shift wasn't announced. It was normalized, step by step. Each decision just slightly easier than the last. Each assumption carried forward without being re-examined. Each warning filed instead of argued. Slow change is the most dangerous kind because it trains you not to notice it. What once required debate now requires alignment. What once demanded proof now demands timing. And over time, the system stops asking whether something should happen. It only asks when. That's the silent shift. From judgment to process. From choice to inevitability. And once inevitability sets in, the next shock doesn't feel shocking at all. It feels overdue. Then comes the moment that's supposed to wake everyone up, a jolt, a shock. Something concrete enough to feel real. Suddenly, the warnings aren't theoretical anymore. Targets are named. Capabilities are demonstrated. Precision is no longer hypothetical. What looks like a crisis is actually a message, not chaos, calibration. Because when a system has been signaling quietly for years and nobody responds, it eventually stops signaling. It starts proving. What matters here is not the strike itself, or the speech that follows, or the panic it triggers behind closed doors. What matters is what becomes undeniable in that moment. The assumption of control was false. The system believed escalation could be managed. That pressure could be applied without consequence. That superiority was permanent. And then reality intruded briefly, sharply, just long enough to reveal how exposed everything actually is. This is the point where decision makers are supposed to slow down. They rarely do. Here's the part that rarely gets explained. The system doesn't fail all at once. It reallocates risk. Those who design the strategy don't absorb the consequences. They distribute them downward, outward. The mechanism is simple. Decisions are framed as containment. But containment depends on someone else absorbing the shock. Bases instead of boardrooms. Markets instead of meetings. Households instead of hearing rooms. What looks like strength is actually exposure shifted onto others. The system rewards those who escalate cleanly, who speak in certainty, who never ask what happens next month, because asking that question slows the machine. And so the benefits concentrate: influence, access, momentum, while the damage disperses across geography, across time, across people who never agreed to carry it. This is how instability becomes policy without being voted on. How escalation feels abstract to those authorizing it, and why the next shock won't be absorbed quietly. It will travel. Now the pace changes. There's no more signaling, no more spacing things out. What was once delayed moves forward all at once. Targets multiply. Timelines collapse. Assumptions stack on top of each other without being tested. Systems designed for deterrence are forced into response. Response becomes reflex. And reflex is fast. Too fast for correction. At this stage, no one is asking for perfect outcomes. They're asking for survivable ones. That's when vulnerabilities matter. Infrastructure, energy, supply. Things that were never meant to be shields suddenly become pressure points because escalation doesn't need to win. It only needs to overload, and once overload begins, control fragments. Messages get missed. Signals get misread. Red lines blur. This is where miscalculation stops being a mistake. It becomes a multiplier. And the system, already moving on momentum, doesn't know how to slow itself down. This is where you enter the story. Not as a voter, not as an observer, but as a variable the system already accounted for. Because when energy prices spike, that's not abstract. When supply chains fracture, that's not theoretical. When uncertainty becomes permanent, that's not someone else's problem. That's your rent, your groceries, your job security. You don't get a briefing, you get the bill. The system treats that as acceptable fallout because it assumes you'll absorb it quietly, adjust, adapt, and maybe you have before. But this time is different because the scale is different. The margins are thinner and there's less slack left in everyday life. If this feels familiar, it should. You've seen this pattern already. If you're still watching, it's because part of you knows this isn't about politics anymore. It's about exposure. And exposure doesn't ask permission. This doesn't stay contained. It never does. Systems like this don't fail locally. They ripple. Energy markets don't recognize borders. Shipping lanes don't care about speeches. Insurance models don't respond to optimism. What begins as a regional calculation becomes a global variable almost instantly. Prices move first, then availability, then confidence. All the quiet dependencies modern life relies on start to wobble at the same time. Manufacturing, food distribution, transportation. And suddenly, decisions made far away start showing up everywhere. Not as headlines, but as shortages, delays, instability that feels hard to explain but impossible to ignore. Allies hedge. Markets flinch, neutral actors reposition, because when escalation stops being predictable, everyone assumes the worst-case scenario. That's how uncertainty spreads faster than force. And once the system reaches this stage, there's no clear center anymore. Just reactions feeding reactions, which is why the next phase isn't about control. It's about trajectory. From here, the system has three possible paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment, quiet recalibration. Signals get reinterpreted. Escalation pauses just long enough for reality to reassert itself. Not peace, just restraint. Temporary, fragile. The second path is erosion. Nothing dramatic, just continued strain. Higher costs, lower tolerance for shock, institutions bending without breaking until they barely function. Life doesn't collapse. It thins, and then there's rupture. That's when assumptions fail all at once. When deterrence misfires, when infrastructure becomes a battlefield, when no one believes escalation can be controlled anymore. Rupture doesn't require intent. It only requires misalignment at speed. And the most dangerous part is this. The system doesn't choose these paths consciously. It drifts into them by rewarding short-term momentum, by sidelining analysis, by treating warning as weakness. Which path emerges depends on something we rarely measure. Whether the system remembers how to slow down before it proves it no longer can. There's a temptation at this point to look for reassurance, for balance, for a clean ending that says someone is in control. There isn't one. Systems like this don't announce their breaking point. They pass it quietly. While everyone is still debating intentions, nothing you've heard here requires bad actors, or madness, or conspiracy. It only requires a structure that rewards momentum over restraint, and a culture that mistakes motion for strategy. The danger isn't what anyone wants to happen. It's what keeps happening when no one stops the machine. If you're unsettled right now, that's not an accident. That discomfort is data. Because once you recognize this pattern, you start seeing it elsewhere. In other decisions, other crises, other moments where speed replaces judgment. This story doesn't end tonight. It doesn't end with one outcome. It continues wherever systems stop listening to reality. And keep moving anyway. Stay with this. Follow the next piece. Because what comes next isn't about what might happen. It's about what becomes unavoidable. Once slowing down is no longer an option.